Okay, hi everyone. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. And I am here tonight with Kat Delgrosso from College Ave. I got a lot of nice emails from people saying after we did our last presentation, which was a little bit more broadly about financial aid and FAFSA, and I got a lot of emails saying, aren't you doing a presentation on CSS Profile? And here we are tonight. I know it was very nice to know that you guys were looking forward to it. I know you're not really looking forward to it, but I'm glad that, we can be here tonight and give you as much information and guidance on the CSS profile. And I do want to thank College Ave Student Loans. I've been partnering with them for several years now. You probably will see their name a lot on things that we do, a lot of presentations and these events, because they've really been dedicated to helping educate families on the financial aid process, on the paying for college process. And I really do appreciate their support. And I hope that you guys do as well. And when it comes time to the loan process, which is a little bit more towards the May, June, and summer time frame, if you do need a private student loan, we'll be talking a lot about that whole process. And College Ave is a fabulous company to look into in terms of all the flexibility that they provide with student loans. So I thank them, and I thank Kat for being here tonight with all of her knowledge. So let me introduce Kat. She's the head of Mid-Atlantic Campus and Event Development at College Ave, and she actually also has a ton of experience and work history working within colleges and the College Board and the CSS Profile. So maybe, Kat, you can give everybody a little bit more about your background, and then we're going to go start into what everybody is here to learn about, which is the CSS Profile.
Okay, great. Thanks, Debbie. So I am currently working at College Ave Student Loans. I've been here for about 4 years, but prior to working here, I was at the College Board for 7 years, just immediately prior to my position at College Ave. And I worked intimately, I would say, with the CSS Profile. And so I know it pretty well inside and out. And then prior to that, I actually also worked at a couple of college campuses in financial aid, and we used the CSS Profile at those institutions, those being Syracuse University as well as University of Rochester. And then I also spent over a decade in student loans previously, so I've kind of come full circle here. And I've been in the business of higher education for about 29 years. So so this is what I do, financial aid.
So just a little bit of housekeeping. This is recorded, so hopefully you will stay on the whole time if you want to ask any questions. But if you have to hop off, you'll get a link to the recording tomorrow. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I will interrupt Kat, if we can take a break. If not, towards the end, we will scroll back and look at as many questions as we can. And I love having these as meetings so that we can see people, but if as much as you can, keep yourself muted, we would appreciate it.
Okay. All right. So let me get started here. So tonight, basically, we're going to cover a little bit about the cost of attendance and what that includes, in addition to certainly how to fill out the CSS profile, some of the high-level things that go into it, and then also common mistakes to avoid when you're filling it out. So those are kind of the 3 main topics for tonight. So when you're applying for financial aid, basically, you're doing that in tandem with the admissions process. So you're applying for admission to the school or a multitude of schools. And anytime after October 1st of the student's senior year in high school, So right now, if the student is a senior, we're past October 1st, so the applications have launched for the next fall. So for the fall of 23-24, those applications have launched. So you're welcome to apply at any time from this point forward. And so, you know, now's the time. This is why Debbie does this at this time of the month, or this particular month of the year, because this is really like a hot topic on your minds, no doubt. If you are, you know, a family member or the student yourself, and you're in the junior year or sophomore year, this is still helpful for you to know, because it's going to be coming around. So when you hit that senior year, it's going to be October 1st of that senior year that these applications launch. Okay. So the first thing that you look at when you're looking at schools is the cost of attendance, or the sticker price. Sticker price, I think, resonates more with people, you know, because it's kind of like if you were to go buy a car, what exactly would be included? You know, what's that sticker say on the outside of a new vehicle? What would it say? It would say, you know, does it include floor mats, or you know, whatever else is, whatever, everything that's in there, it's putting that on that sticker. And so it's important for you to know that when your financial aid is determined, how much you're eligible for, the colleges are required, if they participate within the Title IV, it's called federal aid program, they're kind of required to have a cost of attendance that includes 5 major components. And those include tuition and fees, that's one component. Room and board, which is also like essentially like food and where you would sleep. So if you're off campus, it might be paying rent to a landlord, or it might be buying groceries, but nonetheless, quote unquote, room and board would be your food and your housing. That's the second category. The third category would be books and supplies, which is pretty self-explanatory there. And then you've got personal expenses, things like, you know, you got to buy toothpaste while you're at college, you got to buy all those necessities. So there's personal expenses that get estimated into your sticker price. And then the fifth component is transportation. So that really is basically like your travel between getting to school a couple times a year and home again. So it's not like every single trip, like if the student were to come home pretty often, it's not really taking that into account. It's really more of an average. And I know schools typically will look at, you know, like an average spent on that for the student to at least be able to get there and back a couple times a year. So those numbers, of course, will all vary by each institution. So, you know, you're not going to see the same number at each school. In terms of the types of financial aid applications, and oops, sorry. I'm sorry, I should have turned the slide on that last one, calculating the cost of attendance, to show you kind of that whole sticker price and how that looks. So you've got those 5 categories, and then the cost of attendance is at the bottom. So that is what you'll see in terms of like when you receive a financial aid award letter, when you look at a college's website, the cost, you know, make sure you're taking into account all of these things that could spring up on you when you're affording college. So the first 2 are billed directly by the school, and then the latter 3 categories are really more like you know, things that you're going to be buying on your own or paying for on your own outside of the bill that the school sends to you. So that, and then the room and board one, I should also mention that eventually if the student ends up living off campus, of course, that's not, it may or may not be billed directly by the school. If they're living off campus, you know, they might be paying that landlord directly or going into the grocery store and buying food. But nonetheless, like I said, all of these things are taken into account. So you don't have to worry that, you know, well, hey, is the school taking into account the fact that we have, you know, all these extra expenses that they don't bill for. So, so anyway, that's the gist of that. So let me go back to the prior slide, but I think it's helpful to see that visual. So the types of financial aid applications are going to be the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, and the CSS Profile, which is administered by the College Board. There, at times, you may also encounter a third type of application, which is really like it's called an institutional application. It's kind of a generic term. It's administered basically by the school, and usually the schools usually only ask for that if they want a little bit of extra information, but they don't want to use the CSS Profile fully. They just want to ask, like, they might want to ask you a handful of extra questions beyond the FAFSA. They may have their own institutional application, but I would say that is less common. So it's really a matter of, the FAFSA and the CSS Profile are really the ones that you'll see more often. So let me tell you.
Sorry, can I just interrupt 1 second?
Sure,
Because
sure.
Related to the FAFSA and the institutional and everything. There's a question here about the federal methodology versus the institutional methodology.
Yes.
And that kind of relates to what you were talking about with FAFSA versus, the CSS Profile. And maybe you could explain a little bit about,
Sure.
those two numbers that somebody might see. And somebody is asking, is there any place to know the formulas behind them? I know.
Yes. So, yeah, so let me, I'll briefly just show you the screens here. So this is the FAFSA site, the website, studentaid.gov, where you would go and fill out the FAFSA form right here. And most colleges in the country use the FAFSA. However, there's a handful that decided not to participate in Title IV programs, and therefore they don't require it. But the majority of colleges will require the FAFSA from you each year. And I am going to get to your question. And then the CSS Profile, on the other hand, is only requested at a certain number of institutions. So if you go to cssprofile.org, it redirects to this whole long URL address, but cssprofile.org will get you here. And you can just go right on the front page, and there is a list of all the schools that use the CSS Profile. So now that I've shown you kind of the two websites, so you've got two different applications, and to the question that was asked, there are two different formulas that are associated with each form. So what happens is you fill out the FAFSA, and there's a formula called federal methodology, which the schools, don't really, they don't really publish that per se, but you could Google it, and you could get to it. It's in there. It's just it's a pair. It's kind of the FAFSA really has been pared down over the years, and it's going to be continued to be simplified in 2024. It's scheduled to be simplified a little bit more in 24-25, so one more year. So because right now you'd be applying for 23-24, the fall of 23, the spring of 24, but in a year past that, it is supposed to be simplified. That's the scheduling. So regardless, the federal methodology formula is in tandem with the FAFSA, whereas the CSS Profile is in tandem with a formula that is proprietary to the College Board called institutional methodology. And while there is a base formula that institutional methodology is attached to, some of the colleges and universities will use it in a different way. They may enhance it so that it kind of gives you more allowances within the formula. It allows schools to take into account things like, medical expenses that are not reimbursed by insurance, K through 12, secondary and elementary school tuition as well. It also allows you to put it can also take into account like the cost of living in higher cost cities and areas. I should say zip codes essentially within the country, San Francisco, Washington, DC, Boston, et cetera. So the CSS profile formula is, like I said, a base formula, but there's a lot of extra stuff in there that really actually helps the families to look at their actual picture of what they're having to deal with based on where they live or the types of medical expenses that they've had, or like I said, K through 12 tuition and so on. Hopefully that made sense, but just to reiterate, so the FAFSA is like a cut and dry formula. It's the same everywhere, regardless. So the family contribution that will get calculated by filling out the FAFSA is called the expected family contribution, or the EFC. And that number will be the same number that spits out essentially when you're completing that form. Whereas the CSS profile, it could vary by school, because some of the colleges are taking into account some extra things along the way that you are realistically having to pay in your life from what your family situation is. So again, this is the list of schools that use the CSS profile. You can do a sort on here. You can go by the state. Let's say you're looking at the state of Massachusetts. State of Massachusetts has a lot of CSS profile institutions. They're kind of, they probably have the most of all the states, but there are, there's some that you can see here that don't have as many. You could just show all of the schools and then just, find a couple of schools that you're looking at. If you're applying to a lot of different institutions, and I'm probably jumping around a lot here, Debbie, I'm sorry, but if you're applying to a lot of institutions that use the CSS profile, just be careful, only because it is a fee-based form. So it's a $25 fee for one school. And then it's a $16 fee for each additional school. So I know, having worked at the College Board and with the CSS profile for so long, we always looked at kind of which students filled out the most schools and how many schools did they fill it out for. I remember a couple of years in a row, we had a student fill it out for 37 institutions,
Wow.
which, is not ideal. You would want to kind of, if you have a lot of choices of institutions, just know that if you don't qualify for a fee waiver, the dollar amount can add up.
Well, that was actually a question, how somebody, they asked, how can they get a fee waiver?
Yeah, so the fee waivers are, and actually, if you're on their website here, you can, they have a section here for fee waivers. They actually expanded their fee waivers this past year to families who make up to $100,000 a year. So you can click here and see if you qualify. And that before that, they were offering fee waivers, but they did it based on, like, if you qualify for an SAT fee waiver, you would automatically get it. And if you were an orphan or a ward of the court, you would automatically get a fee waiver. But then last year they expanded it. So if your adjusted gross income, your AGI is up to $100,000 or less, basically, then you would qualify as well. So it opened it up so that there are more and more families than ever who qualify for fee waivers as of the last year when they opened that up like that. So, but again, just check that out on their, if you want to go back and look at that, it's on the main page of CSS Profile's website. Okay, so I probably have jumped around, and that's okay. We're getting it covered. Any questions before I continue, Debbie?
Oh, there's one question here. Somebody's asking that they saw that there were questions some questions are required and some are not.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that they can skip those questions that aren't required?
Technically, you could skip it if it's not required. So it would have, there are certain things that, I'll give you an example, like the CSS profile is different than the FAFSA on this one. It requires things like home equity. What is the value minus your debt of your home? Same for like well, that's a big one right there. Same for your business net worth. Like if you own a business and if it's just a single employee yourself, owning that business, you still have to put it on there, even if, it's just a business owner of one. Whereas the FAFSA, they don't ask for that unless you have over 100 employees. So there's these types of differences basically. And Debbie, I went down the path of, and I think I missed your question.
Required versus not required.
Yeah, required versus not required. There's a question on the CSS profile that is not on the FAFSA, that is regarding retirement value. So like how much, let's say you're 50 years old and you've saved as a parent and you've saved money, all during your working life. They will ask you that on the CSS profile form. Whereas, the FAFSA does not ask for that. That is not a required field. So you could technically leave it blank. If the school is interested in seeing that information, they may come back to you and ask, for it. But it would be school by school, and it would be up to that individual institution. If they saw that you left it blank and they wanted you to tell them the information, they would reach out to you. But yeah, otherwise, if it's not required, you don't have to fill it out. But you could potentially get asked. It just depends on the college. So anyway, there's a few of those things, but like something like home equity, you do have to answer the question. If you don't own your home and you're renting, then you would answer it as such. Whereas the retirement value question, I know, is not a required question. However, let's say you are putting money back for your retirement, and that like either you do an IRA, or you do, like if you do something at the end of the year, that's one way, or maybe you take it out of your paycheck every month, and however you do it. But during that tax year, you put stuff away. Well, both of the forms do ask how much, it's called untaxed income, essentially. How much did you have in that tax year? So when it's related to the amount you've done in that tax year that's being asked about, you will have to put it down on both forms. But it's the full amount that you've saved. That's like your whole bank of retirement funding that you've saved over time. That's the piece I'm talking about that is on the profile, but not on the FAFSA. So, and that is a required field on both forms, the income, but not the asset that you have in totality. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yep.
Okay, so let's see what else is different. So we've talked about the formulas. Those two are very different between the two forms. I shouldn't say very, well, yes, they are very different. The formulas themselves are very different between the two applications. Sometimes the family contribution that gets calculated comes out similar between the two forms. Sometimes, believe it or not, the FAFSA can produce a higher contribution even than the CSS profile. I know that sounds weird because you probably think to yourself, well, if you're asking me for more stuff, then you're going to ask for more money from me. And that is true in some cases, but I'm saying that there are a lot of families that actually end up with a lower family contribution on the CSS profile. And I'll tell you really who those people are. I mean, it's really more like the families who have or maybe just straight wage earners, not a lot of assets per se. A lot of the assets are protected within the formula anyway, but let's say, if you own your home or you own a portion of your home, maybe you have a second home, maybe you have other types of real estate, maybe you have a lot of additional assets and your income is higher. Maybe you're a business owner or something like that. Your contribution will likely be higher on the CSS profile than what's calculated on the FAFSA. And the reason why is because the FAFSA doesn't require you to put down things like home. And like I said before, with the business, if you have fewer than 100 employees, the FAFSA doesn't even want to know what your net worth is currently anyway. I'm going to say this now and probably again tonight. The FAFSA is supposed to change slightly for 24-25. So I'm choosing not to confuse matters because we're in the short term here for for those of you who are kind of looking to the fall of 23. But just know that for 24-25, there are scheduled changes to be on the FAFSA, which will change up a little bit about what I'm saying here. I think I just didn't, Debbie and I, we just don't want to confuse you. We want to give you what is true and right now. And so, you know, right now the FAFSA doesn't ask business owners who have fewer than 100 employees to put their net worth down on their application. So in summary about what's different, it's that home equity, the business net worth. The CSS profile helps you in terms of asking for those extra things like your medical expenses, your K through 12 secondary and elementary school tuition, and allowing you to put down your special circumstances right there on the application, which they give you like 2,000 characters to type in, you know, what might be going on in your household that you wouldn't see by just looking at the numbers. And so it allows you to kind of tell your story right there, as opposed to the FAFSA, which doesn't allow a spot for that. You would have to like send an extra kind of you know, an email or a letter to the schools in their financial aid offices. If they're only using the FAFSA application, you'd have to kind of communicate that extra. Whereas the CSS profile does allow you to put that down right in, it's handy, it's right there in the application. So let's see. So the calculated contributions, I may go back to that at some point here as we're talking, but I'll keep rolling on this slide. So the calculation of financial need. So this slide here actually shows us the formula in general. So you've got your sticker price or your cost of attendance. Those are, you know, interchangeable basically phrases. So you've got your cost of attendance with those 5 categories I told you about earlier, minus the calculated family contribution that comes out. So remember I said, you know, the FAFSA has an EFC that is produced from filling out the FAFSA. That's the expected family contribution that kicks out from filing that form. And then there's a family contribution that is also calculated using the other formula from the CSS profile. The college will determine which one they're going to use. If they use this, if they require the CSS profile application, they will likely use the higher of the 2 contributions or a hybrid between the 2. They probably won't use the lower of the 2. Otherwise they probably wouldn't be a CSS profile using institution in the first place. You know, I mean, they're looking for something, they're looking at more data than the FAFSA asks for. So they're doing that for a reason. So there are a lot of schools though that they're not necessarily going to use the higher of the 2 contributions. They're going to use something in between. So unfortunately, you don't really get to see that because what gets calculated from the CSS profile is not produced on paper for you somewhere, whereas the FAFSA does show you.
Yeah, I was going to mention that the FAFSA, at the end of the FAFSA, and then, you know, you get it in another document later on, you get to see what your EFC is. With the CSS profile, unfortunately, you never really know what your EFC is that their CSS profile calculated until some schools put it on the financial aid offer page that they award letter, sorry, that they send you know, with an acceptance. And sometimes, you know, if your student is accepted, you can reach out to the financial aid office and ask what that number is.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask, you know, may or may not printed on, or I say printed, but you know, everything's electronic nowadays, but so you're probably looking on a student portal as to your financial aid award or financial aid quote unquote letter. It's also interchangeable with the word financial aid offer. So you've got a lot of different language, but they all mean the same thing. It's whatever the school is going to be able to give you. How do they present that to you? They're going to either present it to you in, they might mail you a paper letter, believe it or not. There's still, you know, still some schools who like to do that. They like that. And they may continue for a bit doing that. They may also have a student portal where you could look at it online, and or they may have both, of course. So whether or not you're going to see that physical number, I can't say. But behind the scenes, there's a calculated family contribution that they're using, and then they are at the bottom line coming up with your quote unquote need. And so, you know, that basically is where the rubber meets the road, because that's how they're going to award you with any kind of grants or scholarships or work study or loans.
So that's actually another question, just to clarify. If a school does require a CSS profile, does the family also have to be filling out the FAFSA?
Yes, in most cases. So the FAFSA is required. It's kind of like your overarching application that gets you in the door for all the things. So it's like, if you need any federal loans, if you want to see if you're eligible for any need-based aid, they want you to do the FAFSA because, well, first of all, you can't get, even if you wanted the student to take out a student loan through the federal loan program, you have to fill out the FAFSA. If you want a parent loan through the PLUS loan program, which is the parent loan for undergraduate students, you have to do the FAFSA in order to get that. Sometimes colleges even require the FAFSA before they give out their merit aid, their merit awards, which is like the scholarships. On the admissions side, there are a handful of schools that want you to do the FAFSA for that too. So you could run into a school where I guess they would only ask for the CSS profile if you were, but it would be, I think it would be very seldom. I think most of the time they're going to want you to do the FAFSA at minimum. So I can't think of any that I've run across over time that only needed the CSS profile, but you know, there's about 300 schools that use the CSS profile. So that list I showed you online on their website has about 275 to 300 schools. So, you know, that's a small subset of the 4,000, you know, whatever schools that are in the country that are out there. So you would probably want to check with each individual one, I suppose, if you really wanted to dig into that.
Okay, so you want to move on?
Yeah, so I think up here, so the calculation of need, basically, whether or not the schools will fill up that bucket. So you've got that bucket right there that says financial need. Whether or not they can meet full need is up to them and their endowment, you know, because if they don't have the institutional funds to give you to fill up anything beyond like federal or state financial aid, or but they might only be able to meet a portion of your need. There are also schools that meet 100% of need. So that is something that you can ask the financial aid office or an admissions the admissions folks on campus. But I would say the majority of schools can't afford to meet 100% of need, but they do the best that they can with what they have. I would say that even though high cost private schools, you know, you may look at the sticker price and think, wow, okay, we're just going to apply to an in-state school because it's going to be cheaper to go to a public institution in my home state. Sometimes you may be surprised that it actually, they might have a substantial amount of money to give out, and therefore it could actually be cheaper for you to go to a private school versus a public school right in your home state. So make sure you branch out when you're like right now, when you're applying for admissions, if you're a senior, if this is for a senior, whenever you're applying for admission, don't count yourself out of those other kinds because of schools, because in the end, they might actually end up having generous financial aid awards. It does depend on need. So in outside of the merit scholarship world, it does depend on need. Okay. So let's see here. Debbie, I'm sorry about that. I know I've jumped around a little bit here. So when you fill out the form, what exactly is it being asked for? So the FAFSA and the profile have some similarities here. So you've got information's coming from the parent, the student, and it includes income and assets. It looks at the number in family, number in college in that household. And it's looking at taxable and untaxable income. The assets it's a variety of assets. But as I said before, the home is something that's unique to the profile. The business net worth is unique to the CSS profile, unless, there's over 100 employees. The 529 college savings plans go under the parent's name on the assets section, but that's also the same for the FAFSA. So they ask for the 529s as well. And then we talked about the retirement value question there, but that is only on the CSS profile in terms of how much you saved over time.
Okay, so before we move on past the assets, there's a few questions. Maybe just go a little bit more detail about 529 plans. Exactly what type of plans are included. If I have multiple kids and I have different, in my head, I have different 529s for them. Am I only putting the 529 for the child who's applying to college, or am I doing something else? And then the other 529 question is related to grandparents who might have a 529 for a student.
Okay. So the 529 plans are whatever you own as in the household that we're talking about here, that's going on the form. If you own a 529 plan, it goes under the parent assets, even if you own it for other siblings. So
just to make it clear to people, the student is the beneficiary of a 529.
Mhm.
Usually it is the parent, or it could be a grandparent who is the owner. So
Correct.
You might think you have multiple 529 accounts, and you might, they could be for each of your children, and that would mean that the different child is a different beneficiary, but it's actually the parent who is owning all of those accounts.
Correct. So that is a very good way to put it, because that's why it goes under the parent name on the application. And that's actually good for you, because if it were under the student's name, even though the student is the beneficiary, it's a college savings plan. You're saving it for college. You're saving it for this, the student whose application you're filling out. If you had to put it on their assets under the student section, it would be counted way more heavily. So it would be counted at 25% of your total amount. So let's say Kat, me, I'm going to college. My parent has a 529 for me. If I put it in my name on the application, it's going to get calculated at 25% of my assets if I put it under the student's name in the profile. If it's under the parent's assets, it actually is only treated at about a 3 to 5% amount for under the parent assets. So the parent assets get whittled down very heavily within the formula, whereas the student assets get calculated at a much higher percentage. But the benefit here is that the college 529s are actually going under the parent assets, which is a good thing for you. But you are the owner as the parent, so it's going under your information on these applications. So if the grandparent owns it, the grandparent is actually not on this application. So therefore it's not in your household in terms of what the grandparent has saved. If they're the owner, it doesn't go on here. So same with, an aunt or an uncle. So if you're basically like, think of it this way, it's like, well, what are your cash what's your checking account have in it? What do your investments have in them? What do you have for real estate? All that stuff that you see there in that second sub bullet of the that we're, kind of going over right now. All those things that belong to you are going on this form. The one that the grandparent technically opened and is the owner of is not owned by you. So that's why it's not on here.
And so, can you talk more about home equity and how you value, to include what value of the home do you include on the CSS profile?
Okay, so the home, so don't forget when you fill out the CSS profile that you're putting your equity of your primary residence, and the equity is the value minus the debt. So don't forget to put the debt down, because I have talked to people in the past who miss that and they put down how much their home is worth and then they forget to put the amount they owe against it. Therefore, you're being overcounted. You're overcounting an amount. If you have a mortgage on it, you certainly don't want the school to be taking into account a higher value than what you really have in terms of equity. So make sure you calculate it as value minus debt. So the way that you should fill out the profile is to, if you were to sell your house today, what would you put it on the market for? So it's not your tax assessment that you would use. It's really like, especially lately, in the last year, the home values have just gone all kinds of crazy. So like if you were today going to go sell your home, what would the value be? You 9 times out of 10 probably would not have to produce any proof of that. I suppose there could be some schools that want to see something when if they're getting into the nitty gritty of your application, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's just based on, honesty of filling out the forms, and just make sure you put your debt against it so that you're getting counted. You only want to count what you currently have access to, essentially, in terms of equity. And also, it's always good to think regarding the home equity. You might say to yourself, well, what do gosh, these schools want me to sell my house to pay for college. And that is not the case. What is actually happening behind the scenes is that the schools are asking for the CSS. The schools that are asking for the profile are asking because they tend to have a lot of money to spend. So they tend to be like, a lot of them are private institutions. There are some schools on there that are on that list I showed you that are, flagship public schools like University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, or UNC Chapel Hill, or the University of Virginia, UVA. These schools, whether they're public or private, if they're using the profile, it means they tend to have a lot of money to spend, and they want to spend their money as equitably as possible. And in order to do that, they need more data than what the FAFSA requires. So that's kind of why they ask for it. They're not saying they want you to sell your home, but what they do want to do is to look at family A versus B. If family A rents, and they don't have any equity to draw from over time, that family is at, less of an advantage than a family who does have a home, has been able to have a home and build on that equity over time, and in the end has an asset, versus a family that doesn't have much equity or is renting or something like that. So it's really just a way to equitably spend their money, to look at, everything apples to apples. And that's one of the main differences between the FAFSA and the profile currently, anyway.
So explain a number in family, like how many, who does that include? A lot of times we get a question about a grandparent that might be, living with the family, and the family is really, for all intents and purposes, taking care of that grandparent financially, medically, would
Mhm.
that be considered, a person in in the number that they would include?
Yeah, so if there's a grandparent who's living in the household, you would include that person. It's the rule of thumb is, are you providing greater than half of their support? So if they're living in your household, they're eating, you're paying for the groceries, you're paying for potentially some or all of their personal care needs and maybe getting them to and from medical appointments and things like that. But yeah, so if they're living in the household, you can include them in the family. Same would go for like an aunt or an uncle, or maybe you have a brother or a sister who's living, me being the parent, maybe my sister or my brother is living in our household. So you can include anyone who's living within the household essentially, but the rule of thumb is kind of like if you're providing greater than half their support. Now, let's just go with the example of what if there's a grandparent who doesn't live with you, but they're in, need of extra assistance on a monthly basis, and you're sending them, $500 a month, or you're helping pay for their assisted living facility or something like that. While they wouldn't necessarily be counted, they don't live in your household, they don't live inside your home. What you could do, and what could easily be taken into account on the CSS profile, is to type that into that special circumstances section, where I mentioned before that you get, 2,000 characters to type in your story. You could it's a very common thing that you were taking care of an elderly grandparent, and, here's the estimate of how much we spend per month on that person, because that's a valid thing to include, because that's really taking away, I mean, I don't mean that in a negative way, but it is forcing some of your income to go in other directions. That means that income is not available for towards college. So you do want to tell that story, because the schools will, if I were you, I would tell the school, each of the institutions, and they can maybe take that into account in the formula.
And so now get to the question about the number in college, at least this year, and maybe in the future. The CSS profile does ask how many of the students are also in college.
Correct. And really, it does not include like if a parent is in college. So it's really more like the siblings, or and then of course there's always one in college because that's the student you're applying for. But then is there a second or a third or a fourth in college at the same time for that academic year? So, and they have to be the way that the form is worded, I think, is you have to be at least half time. So it wouldn't be like if a sibling is taking one course, that wouldn't be counted. But if they're doing at least half time, which is basically like 2 courses during a term, that's considered at least half time. So, but so they don't count parents, and they don't count less than half time, just to summarize that.
Okay, so there have been a lot of questions which I haven't answered because I knew you were going to get to it, about divorce, separated situations.
Mm-hmm. So, so the way that the way that this all works with the let me clarify, the FAFSA is only asking the person who fills that out is the parent who is providing greater than half the support of the student, and then a step parent if they're remarried. Okay, so that's the FAFSA. On the profile, you have to fill out, if you're remarried, and the step parent would go on the application with you as the parent who's providing greater than half the support. So you've got 2 parents on the application. Let's say you're divorced but not remarried, or let's say you were never married, or let's say you're separated. Those cases, that means there is not another parent living within your household. But the CSS profile schools sometimes ask you to fill out, they ask you to have that other biological or adoptive parent to fill an application out. So let me review that again. So if you're back here on the CSS Profile application, excuse me, the website, you can see there's a column here that says CSS Profile, non-custodial parents. So you can sort it any way you want, or you can just go look at a college you're looking at, you know, like Boston University. There's a yes there in that column. That means they want, in the case where you're a single parent in the house, you're divorced, separated, or never married, where is the other biological parent? Because they're going to need to fill out their own CSS Profile application for any of the schools in this column that say yes. So, you know, there's a lot of them. So a lot of the CSS Profile schools do want the other biological parent to also complete an application. Now, what that means that can vary in terms of what happens in the end. So, because you might say to yourself, well, geez, I'm remarried. Why do they need, you know, a third and potentially fourth parent to put their information on another application if that other biological parent is remarried too? You know, that could add up to 4 parents essentially. And that's a very good question. Each of the colleges will treat this in a different way. So, Debbie, you want to shoot me any questions, let me know. But essentially, in summary of that, divorced, separated, or never married, it is possible you might have to have the other biological parent fill out their own separate application for the CSS Profile. I will add on to that to say, because it usually comes up anyway. So let's say, for example, you're divorced and the other biological parent is like nowhere to be found. You have no contact. You have an adversarial relationship. That person maybe doesn't know the student hardly at all since they were born. I could go on and on. There's a variety of things that happen. You can request from the colleges, if you are in that situation and you really don't have any contact with that other person, you can request a waiver of the CSS Profile. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the screen again. But so if you know that, okay, I'm going to apply to, you know, Baylor in Texas here, they want the form from the non-custodial parent, but I don't know where he or she is. What do I do? So here's what you can do. If you're on the profile main page here, there is a little bit of information here about completing the profile for that person to do, but also, I think it's right here where it says divorced or separated families. You click learn more. And there is a waiver process. There is a waiver, a waiver form that the College Board has created. It's right here. So you can fill this out and you can send it in to any of the colleges that you know need the CSS Profile from that person. Sometimes the college, well, actually all the colleges will have their own form, but some of them just use this one because they've worked, I mean, the College Board created it several years ago, and sometimes it's just easier for the schools to use this one type, and then you can send it to all the different schools that use the CSS Profile, and just that way you don't have to fill out like 5 different, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different forms. You're only filling out this one, and then you're disseminating it out to each of the institutions that require it. So again, that's on the, you know, you just click there, a couple of clicks in from the main page, and you can find that there as well. So, okay, Debbie, what kind of questions?
Well, you know, you showed, there's just a quick question, and it was on that the College Board webpage.
Sure.
About what's IDOC?
Oh, IDOC, I also worked with that closely at the College Board. It's basically if a school wants to ask for tax returns from you or W-2 forms, or 1099s or business tax returns, they sometimes will use IDOC. So it's basically stands for the Institutional Documentation Service. And it basically is a means for the schools to gather all those types of documents from you. And it, quite frankly, is handy if like all of your schools use IDOC, because then once you submit it, it goes to all of them. If you've got like a one-off school that doesn't use IDOC, you have to send that to them in their own way. But if let's say you're applying to like Boston College and Bowdoin and Brandeis and Brown, you know, they all use IDOC. So when you upload it, if you're requested to upload it, you'll be told that later on. You don't have to know that right. You wouldn't know that right now anyway. But if you're requested to upload it, it's automatically going to go to all of them. So it's very handy if you're asked for that extra data.
And the other column, which maybe you just want to point out, is for international parents.
Yeah, it's for international students.
Sorry, right.
Yeah. So basically some of these colleges have anybody who's using that, which I just sorted it by the word yes. What that means is they've got money to spend on international students, and this is a way for them to figure out how to use it or how to spend it. So, you know, if you are the parent of an international student who is not a US citizen or a permanent resident in this country, and your school uses that form, let's say Barnard here or Bates, then you would also be filling out the same application. It's the same exact one on this website. And then the school will let you know if you qualify for any grant-based aid, need-based grant-based aid through that institution. So there's a lot of schools here that are using that. It looks like, yeah.
Kat, a few people have asked, I've actually tried to search for this as well. Is there a PDF version of the CSS profile that, you know, people can kind of look at before going in and creating the account and actually filling it all out?
No,
I didn't think so. I couldn't find one.
not anymore. However, there is some schools that use it for international students. There is like this one type that's called it's like a paper form of the international one. It's the International Student Financial Aid Application, or the ISFA. So the schools technically have they could get you that, but it's probably not something you're going to be able to Google and find on every school's website or anything like that. But it's really not submittable. You can't submit it electronically. It's, so it's just more of it really just kind of helps you start out before you start out the application. But to be honest with you, you could usually the College Board had, I don't know if they have the videos on here anymore, but they did have this one here. Okay, so getting started on the left, they did have videos in here that show you kind of talk about they do have it here. Okay, they still have it. The CSS Profile tutorial, and it'll guide you through step-by-step instructions. So you could, if you had a few minutes, you could listen to that, and it might help you out with at least before you get started as well. And there's also a parental tutorial I see here as well. So those are at least worthwhile to check out, and they're not all that long.
So can you also clarify when you start the form, do you have, just like in FAFSA, the student has an account, the parent has an account, and for the CSS profile, are you going through the student's College Board account? Does the parent have to make a separate account? How should that work?
So the student creates a username and a password. That's a video. I don't want to click on that right now, but I would suggest clicking on this to learn how to apply, and that'll give you, they want you to do enter your graduation year. So I won't do that right now for the purpose of time here, but I would recommend going through this right here where it says learn how to apply. because it's probably a pretty quick high level on that answer to that question. But usually the student would, I think it's the College Board account that they had when they completed the SAT. What I did want to clarify though is if a divorce, separated, or never married, that type of family needs to have that CSS profile filled out. They have to create their own account, obviously, because one parent, you wouldn't, obviously that parent can't come in and see the other parent's information. They need to be separate, and then they get matched up behind the scenes based on the student. So I know for the non-custodial parent, they have to have their own login. Those are two different logins for those two different sets of families, if that's your situation. But when the student is filling out the CSS profile application, I believe they can still use the one that they had when they had filled out the SAT.
And I mean, this is the question, who's really filling this out, the parent or the student?
Well, I mean, the parent really has the information that's needed for most of the questions. It's really the parent filling it out, because you've got to put in your income information, your asset information, and the student doesn't know that usually, when they're a high school student. They don't have access to your tax returns and that type of thing. So it's really the parent who's doing it, but you're both technically electronically signing it in the end. But yeah, I mean, the parent data is really the part that takes the longer amount of time, particularly if you have a multitude of properties, like other real estate. If you've got a business, if you have a home, it takes a little bit longer to complete it if you have a lot of those things versus families who, they've got wages coming from W-2 forms and, not a lot of assets. It's a little easier to fill out. That's all. But I would say most of the time it's really it's not the student filling it out, like the bulk of it. So.
Okay. You want to go back to some of your slides and I'll see what other questions there are?
Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of a graph that shows the difference between the two forms. I know I've talked about all these things, but this is kind of a list of what's on the profile, but not on the FAFSA, that type of thing. The one piece that I haven't actually said tonight is that the income that's used for the fall of 23. So if this is a senior in high school right now, as I said earlier, you can fill out the FAFSA and the CSS profile as of October 1st for next fall. And the income that's used for that is from 2021. Which is older data, but they now do that on purpose with both of the forms because your tax year is already completed for 21. So it allows you to be able to apply this early. It used to be that you would have put your 2022 income down and it was just harder because, the 2022 year is not over yet. So it just meant that applications could have come in much later into the process. So this allows you to put in income that you already have filed on your tax returns from 2021. When you fill out the FAFSA, you can actually hook it up to the IRS. It's called an IRS data retrieval tool, and it'll pull in the data from the IRS directly. Unfortunately, the College Board does not have access to a federal agency, the IRS. So therefore, they don't have the ability to pull that in from the IRS. So you do have to fill it in, online. So 2021 income is being used for both of these forms. But when it comes to the assets, it's going to be the assets as of today or the day you file the form. So if you're filling it out today, it'll be today's assets. So you don't have to worry about what day am I trying to pull that from? So that's the difference there. And then I've talked a lot about these things through the other slides, but the business net worth stands out, home equity, retirement value, not in the calculation. And then any special circumstances are also mentioned on the CSS profile. There's a field for medical expenses, but if you want to explain them further in that larger block, that section that you can, kind of free form where you can type it out, you can put more information about that if you would like to explain the numeric value that you entered in that field on the CSS profile. And there may be other questions like, the K through 12 elementary and secondary school tuition could be a field, but it may not be required for every school because some schools take that into account and some don't. And I know that makes it very squishy for you in terms of, like, gosh, each school's doing their own thing. How do I keep track of all this? And I realize that is difficult, but truth is you really don't know how they're taking into account unless you happen to ask them. But I will tell you that the schools are doing things, they tweak it a little bit on the back end because some of them, if they have even more, funding to spend on you, they might want to take into account those extra things like the K-12 tuition. Versus another college might be using the CSS profile, but they can't quite afford to, they don't have the ability to meet 100% of your need, and they may not take it into account. So I would say, put down everything possible that you're spending out there. It is, and then whatever they take into account is just going to help you. It's not likely in terms of like consumer debt, such as credit card debt, that they would take that into account. But you can always put that in your special circumstances section, but that's not common that they would take that into account in the calculation. Okay, Debbie, any questions, or I want to move on?
Yeah. It was a good question higher up. Sorry. Well, just as a minor question, but if you start the CSS profile and you, can't finish it all in one setting, can it be saved?
Yes. Yep, you can go back to it.
Okay. What about if somebody has twins?
You have to fill out 2 different profiles.
I know, horrible answer.
You have to fill out 2 different FAFSAs and 2 different profiles.
How does somebody figure out their business value to be included on the CSS profile?
Well, if you have a building, it would be, what is the building worth? If you have supplies, like if you have supplies that maybe you sell a product and you have a building that has all of the supplies that of the product that you're selling, that would be counted as part of your total net worth, essentially. So it's basically like if you were to sell your business today, with the building and the contents, how much would you sell your business for? And then do you have any debt against it? Maybe you have a mortgage because you own that, you have that building, but you're paying a mortgage against it. So you would obviously want to subtract that because that's the debt against it. And then that equals essentially whatever your business equity is. So yeah, it's kind of like the house and home equity. It's the value of it minus the debt against it. If you were to go sell any of that today, what would it be? And then you kind of go for the bottom line of value minus debt.
Okay, so this was the question that was asked multiple times that I know people want an answer for. How do you answer the question? How much do our parents? This question that asks, how much am I do I expect to pay for the student?
Oh yeah, so there's a question on the CSS profile. It's really, that's a squishy question. I don't think that one's required still. I guess if you leave it blank, they're going to calculate whatever regardless. So it's more of a good faith, like, okay, well, what was I thinking that I could pay for the student this year? You know, if I'm taking some out of the 529 plan and I have, you know, income, I have other assets, you know, what can I realistically pay? And there's probably some magic number that you've had in your head as a family, you know, what can we realistically afford? And remember, it is a 4-year to 5-year decision, unless the student is looking at a community college, of course, it'd be shorter. But if it's, you know, a 4 to 5 year decision that you're making, so you're thinking, okay, I know we can afford $10,000 a year, then you put $10,000 down on there. I mean, it's really kind of a, don't overthink it. It's really more of a, you know, what have you kind of been thinking in your mind in the last, you know, 6 months to a year as the student has gotten up in towards their senior year? What can you realistically afford? And that just, honestly, that number could have changed during COVID if you experienced a job loss, or if you experienced any changes in your financial situation at all. You may be in a different spot than you were a year ago. So yeah, I know that really is the answer though. It's just kind of like, what do you think is realistic? And 9 times out of 10, they may not use that number anyway. They're just going to use whatever they come up with. So it's not going to be like a stick to it number, I don't think.
Okay, there are definitely more questions, but why don't you go through these slides and then I'll kind of scroll through the questions.
Okay. So this is just an example of need versus like what the gap, you know, kind of how this stuff gets calculated. Sorry, I'm losing my voice slightly. So if you're looking at a school that's $75,000, the cost of attendance or the sticker price, and then the calculated family contribution is $35,000. The calculated need is at $40,000 for that example. So the school may or may not be able to give you $40,000 in financial aid. So below you might see the example is shown where, oh gosh, I'm sorry. The actual financial aid that is offered is only $25,000 in that example. And that means that your gap is actually larger than what you anticipated when they calculated your family contribution. So the question is basically like, what does the college or university have available to give you in financial aid? They may or may not be able to meet your need 100%. But hopefully you will be in a situation where they will. And this is where I feel like, you know, applying to a private institution that is higher cost might actually turn out to be okay if they're able to give you more than you really anticipated. And it could end up being cheaper than a public institution in some cases. So it's worth it to apply where the student, it might be a really good fit for the student in terms of like their surroundings and the friends that they'll make and the majors that they have access to and all that. So sometimes you're surprised. You know, I worked at a couple of high cost private schools and we had a very substantial amount of financial aid to spend. And so people who didn't think they could afford it ended up coming and they loved it there. So, you know, I think it just matters, like just to apply and see what happens. You know, as long as you have some choices when it comes time, that'll be key. So, okay. I've talked about a lot of these types of special circumstances and this process. Let's see. Oh, keep in mind that you may need to turn in documentation to prove certain types of expenses like medical expenses. So just be prepared that whatever you put in to like that special circumstances box, that you might end up having to produce some kind of documentation, but not always, but sometimes you would. I mentioned this before, but consumer debt is not typically considered. So I mean, I know that's not a good thing, but it has not typically been considered over the years. Let's see, just a reminder that the FAFSA doesn't allow a space for this. So you do have to write a letter to them at each of the financial aid offices, you can just kind of copy it. You don't have to rewrite it for everybody. You just create a letter and then send it to each of the financial aid offices so that they have it. But if it's a CSS profile school, you have a spot to put that information in. And if it's longer than 2,000 characters, then you would have to attach a letter or something like that and send that in. And that's considered appealing your financial aid eligibility. So that's what the word appeal means to them. If you have special circumstances, you're essentially appealing the original financial aid award to have them reconsider for additional aid.
And what about if a parent is on the older side, like older than average, maybe, 70 or plus? Does that get factored in any place in the CSS profile?
Yes, it does actually. So, well, the age of the older parent is a field on the FAFSA. So that is automatically taken into account for that as well, on the FAFSA as well. But the CSS profile does look at the same thing. So if you're closer to retirement, essentially it protects you more within the formula in terms of how the percentage of the percentage that comes out in terms of what your contribution will be. It basically protects you because you're a little bit older and therefore you're closer to retirement. So yeah, it does do that for you behind the scenes and actually in both formulas. So, which is nice,
So somebody's just clarifying, does the special circumstance expenses have to be the student expenses? It can be the family expenses.
No, it could be just the family expenses. Yeah. In fact, most of the time it's really the parents' expenses that are being paid out by the parent. On most of the appeals have to do with what the parents are experiencing based on their income or asset. Things that are affecting their income or affecting their assets in a way that prevent them from spending as much on college as it appears they can afford to spend. Any other appeal questions, Debbie?
No, but somebody's asking, going back to retirement, do you have to estimate the value of your pension?
Yeah, I mean, that would be considered the question about retirement value. So over here on the right, so if you have, it's basically whatever you have available to you or would have available to you once you retire.
Oh, now I understand. People were asking, I didn't know what they were referencing. Retirement value, and then we have in parentheses, not in calculation.
Yeah.
I don't remember why we had that phrase, not in calculation.
That I put that there because it's not actually in the formula for institutional methodology. So when
you're saying it's not like so that they ask for the retirement value, but you're just noting it's not used in the actual calculation.
Yeah, that's right. Because
Okay.
it's not like it doesn't automatically take into account that, oh, okay, you put that you have $400,000 saved up. It doesn't get added to like your cash and savings and your checking and all that as total assets. It's really an external question that is not anywhere. The calculation never takes it into account. It's more of an FYI for the school. And therefore it's not in the calculation.
So, is there any place in the form in the calculation that your property taxes are taken into account? For those families that are living in high cost of living areas.
Yeah, so sort of, yes, in the sense that the allowances within the formula include things like your state tax and other taxes in addition to your federal taxes withheld. So it's based on the other taxes and the state taxes take into account things like, obviously your state tax based on it's looking at each individual state. And it also gives you like additional allowances in some cases if you're living in higher cost areas. And I was saying earlier that some schools will use what's called a cost of living adjustment factor. It's a COLA factor. And it's like if you're living in a zip code that's more expensive, it'll give you additional, the formula will give you additional allowances against your assets, which means that your contribution will be less than what somebody from, I always use this example, like if you live in Manhattan, New York versus Manhattan, Kansas, which is a place that exists, you know, you're obviously have a higher cost of living, and therefore your calculation, if all else was equal, your family contribution would be less if you're from Manhattan, New York versus Manhattan, Kansas, if all else was equal. If a school is using that cost of living adjustment factor in their formula, because some schools can afford to do those extras if they have enough endowment to produce higher grant aid. So they try to use as much as they can to help you out in the formula, because it does cost you more to live in those certain places. But not every college can afford to do that, because they only have they only have a certain amount of, you know, they don't have an endless amount of institutional grant funding to give you, so they can't meet 100% of your need. So they're already, you know, but they're doing the best that they can. But so it does vary by institution.
What if a family has another child, not the one that's going to college, that might have special needs, and because of that, you know, they have higher expenses kind of supporting that special needs child? How does that get factored in?
Yeah, I mean, so that would be considered a special circumstance, anything outside of what's already asked for on the application. So for example, excuse me, if some of those are considered medical expenses that are not reimbursed by insurance, that automatically is asked for on the CSS profile, so that'll be in there. But let's say there's other things, maybe a special school that they're attending that costs money for extra tuition, or just anything really. I mean, it's a matter of you communicating via the special circumstances section, or a letter if you have you want to tell more of the story, and it takes more than 2,000 characters to type it. Then you can write a letter and explain what's happening. And then it's best if you include any numbers, because the financial aid office is going to want to know, let's just put it this way, this is all based on math. It's all mathematical. It's financial, it's numbers. And so the more numbers they have to affect the formula, it's easier for them. You know, it's not quite so, you know, subjective. So the more expenses you can actually put on paper, like, okay, this is what we put out every month for this child's school, or their medical expenses, or, you know, fill in the blank, anything else. And yeah, for sure, the schools will take a look at that, but it's a lot easier if you have numbers to back it up, because whatever you're spending extra for a special needs child is obviously funds that you don't have available to spend on college next year. So the more data you can provide, the better it is for them to recalculate maybe how much you're eligible for and see if they can give you some additional grant money. So yeah, that would be a really, you know, definitely someone I would recommend appealing to tell their story.
What about, is it possible to correct the CSS profile once it's submitted? If I guess you maybe realized you made a mistake, or B, maybe you've actually had to adjust your tax forms, tax returns.
Yeah, I still think they're not allowing the changes, updates. in which case you would just have to let each of the colleges know what piece of information was incorrect, and then they'll recalculate it on their end. But it's not like the FAFSA. The FAFSA, you can go in and make a correction electronically, but the profile, I don't believe I think they're still not allowing changes online. There might be, you know what though, I think they made a change where you could do a few things, but it's not like the whole thing. So let me give you an example. So let's say you put down, you had, $20,000 of cash savings checking in that area. But then you went and bought a car or something. So now you don't have that anymore. Like that field, I know you can't change. But I do think that with my last conversation I had with the College Board rep, because I do try to make sure I'm up to date. I believe there were a couple things that you could change, but I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly what they are, but it's not everything. So just, let each college know, the financial aid office know, send them an email or call or an online chat, maybe, just to get the process started if you made a mistake.
There's a few questions here about, does any information that's provided in the CSS profile, do you think it has any impact on whether the student is actually accepted? Or is it just related to will they get money and how much money?
So there is something called need blind and something called need aware. Some schools, what that means basically is that if a school is need blind, when you apply for admission, they don't look at anything related to your financial aid application. And that means they're need blind. They're blind to anything related to financial. So some schools will publicize that they're a need blind institution, and never the two shall meet. Either they accept you or they don't, and then financial aid gets looked at. Some schools are need aware, where they might take a look at it. We didn't call, like the schools I worked for at the time, we didn't say that we were need blind out loud, but really we were need blind because we didn't look at the financial aid stuff until it was completely separate. So I think it definitely varies by institution. I'm not sure if you can easily figure out if they're need blind or need aware, but
well, people are wondering on that particular question that asks how much a parent is willing to contribute, if that impacts potentially an acceptance or not.
I doubt it. I mean, I think there could be a lot of times the admissions process is happening before the financial aid stuff goes out. Some of it they have to do at the same time because there's so many more financial aid applications. You don't know who's going to get accepted, so you're having to review people who may or may not be accepted yet. So I can only speak from experience. We never looked at that. I mean, our admissions office never looked at that before they accepted anyone. But that's not to say that it couldn't be done. So, if they have your CSS profile on file, and they see that you can contribute something, I mean, if they have that field available, it's sitting on their campus in online. Technically they could use the data, but I don't think all schools use that data ahead of time. And I don't think they all I think there's a lot of schools that don't look at that before the student's admitted or not.
Kat, do we have a slide that talks about like common mistakes?
Yes. Yeah. So this is, I know I've said a couple of these things before, but excuse me. Because the income, remember I said back here that the income for next fall is for 2021. Keep in mind that while that is the income that's required on the forms, if there's older income that's being used and your situation has completely changed since then, you're going to definitely want to tell the schools about your new income situation. So that would be by way of the special circumstances section, or an email or a letter to the schools. Because maybe you lost a job, or maybe you lost a job, you picked up another job, but now you're making less money. You want to tell them about that, because you definitely don't want them using 2021 income data if that's no longer your situation. So that's a big one. Be sure to tell them if you have had a major change. If it's $1,000 off or something like that, that's probably not enough to make a big deal with the way the formula is calculated. But I would just make sure that you're very cognizant of getting that information to the right people. And the right people would be those people in financial aid. The home equity, make sure you're putting down that debt against the value of any of home or real estate or farms, because that will make a big difference. Oh, I mean, I know assets are not treated as heavily as income within the formula. I mentioned that before, where the assets are, it's really for the parent assets, it's only taking like 3 to 5 or maybe 6% of your assets in the calculation. But still, you want to make sure that your debt is being reflected as well, if you're paying a mortgage on anything. Special circumstances, just think through it fully. What am I not showing on paper here? You're one of many people applying. You could be, if you apply at NYU, how many applications do they get, for example? Any of these schools, they're looking at a lot of applications. So think through it fully. What was not asked on the form that you think you need to make sure that they know about in your current situation. It's important. That retirement income I addressed quite a bit. So it's, again, it's not a required field, I don't think, and it's not in the calculation of need, but it is something that the schools might eyeball if they have that information there. Or they may not look at it at all, to be honest. So I think it makes people panic when they see that question.
Yes.
But it's truthfully, like, we did not take it into account at my school, but I will say, I'll give you an example of when it might be taken into account. Let's say you saved $1 million of retirement and you're 55 years old as a parent applying for this child in college. And you decide that you want to appeal the financial aid letter that you were given. And I have another family B, that didn't really save much in retirement, and doesn't, basically they're asking for more money. If I'm looking at those two families on paper, the family who has saved all that money, as opposed saving it into retirement as opposed to saving for college, that was a choice that was, we put all of our money over here and not as much here for college. You might have a school who looks at that and says, well, you're at more of an advantage because you've saved so much over time than family B. But, aside from that, I don't really know what else schools would really be looking at it for, if they're looking at it at all. So I wouldn't really panic about that per se. But like I said, I do think it is not a required field, but I believe that's still the case. It's not required. But
so actually, there's a good question. Sorry to interrupt before you finish all the mistakes. About, do you need to fill and submit the FAFSA and the CSS profile at the same time? How important is it those numbers match exactly?
Well, the income's going to match exactly because you're looking at 2021 income, basically. So that year's already done and over with. The tax year's out. That's going to match. But the assets won't match, because if you're filing it a month later and you bought a car in between, or you put a down payment on a house in between, then your assets won't match. But it won't really matter too much. I mean, let's face it, you only have so much time. We're all busy. you doing it the same day might not be realistic. Maybe you don't have time. So, you do the FAFSA now, and then maybe 2 weeks from now, you do the CSS profile on a weekend when you have a chance. That's normal. We're all human beings. So don't worry so much about that unless you had like something major that was different within your assets. Then I would say the school will probably, I don't know, they'll either ask you for clarification of why there was such a big difference, or they'll make an assumption and they'll use the higher of the two maybe. But it's if it's a major difference, they may ask you a question. But if it's just a relatively normal difference of regular expenditures between one date to the next, I think they probably won't ask you.
And okay, I'm jumping around a little bit, but there's a question here asked for divorced families and getting information from the non-custodial parent. I guess you just have to notify that parent. How does that parent get that form?
So there is a method where the email address of that non-custodial parent is entered, and then they automatically get an email that triggers them to go online to do it. In addition to that, the student or whoever can they can tell that parent to go online and initiate the process on their own anyway. But there is a spot for the email address to go. So it's either the student, either the non-custodial parent can go in and start the process, or eventually they're going to get notified with their email address being in there from the custodial family putting it in. And they'll get triggered. Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, so one or the other way, it doesn't matter which one happens first. If the non-custodial parent wants to start it out and go do it first, they can, or they can wait for that email to arrive and then they can trigger and go in.
In terms of untaxed income for FAFSA and the CSS profile, is what is included in untaxed income the same for both, or does one include something different than the other?
So it's mostly the same, except if I'm going back to this chart here. So I have certain untaxed income on the left, the third row down. So if you are a needier family and you have child tax credits or earned income credit on your tax return, those don't count on the FAFSA. The earned income credit doesn't count on the FAFSA, but it does on the CSS profile, that type of thing. But those are higher need families, lower income families that tend to have that provision within the tax law. So, but most of it's the same, but there are just a couple of things that are no longer required on the FAFSA that, like that earned income credit.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not really where the difference, that's not going to trigger much in terms of the differences between the two forms. It's really the assets where there's major differences, and also the provisions on the profile for using those extra expenses like medical, K-12 tuition, and all those other things. Special needs kids, that we talked about earlier, all those types of things. You just have a better chance at telling your story on the CSS profile without an extra step. If it's a school that only needs the FAFSA, you can still tell them your story. You just have to make sure you write the letter or an email about it.
Okay, I am just if there's, I think you might have one or two more left.
Yeah, so I think we talked about the second to last bullet already with the other household members. So if you have if siblings in college, as long as they're at least half time, and a parent in college doesn't count in the formula, unless there's some special circumstance. It's not automatic, I don't think, anymore. if the parent's in college, but if there's a special circumstance, maybe mom or dad's going back for something, I'm sure the school can help you in some way. They might not be able to treat it like as a, full-fledged number in college in the calculation, but they might help you out if there's something there with a special circumstance. The last bullet is about educational loans. So let's say you took out a parent loan for an older sibling who's in college, and you're paying that back in addition to now you've got a freshman coming in as a first-year student. That doesn't calculate in the either formula, the federal methodology or institutional methodology between the two forms. But you can put that under your special circumstances. And like I said before, numbers this is all about math. So when they recalculate need, they need something to recalculate the need with. So if you need to kind of be clear of here's how much I'm paying in educational loans, and then a proof of that might help as well when you send in like anything about that extra circumstance there. But sometimes I ran into that, certainly with families who were paying back parent, federal plus loans or private loans for the older siblings.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kat. There were a ton of questions. We probably didn't get to everything, but I think we covered a lot of topics. And I think I need to give you a break so that you can restore your voice.
I'm so sorry. I'm a little scratchy on the voice, but I hope you can all hear me okay. I had my husband bringing me some extra water, so I had, I was prepared, but I didn't expect to lose my voice a little bit there.
Yeah. So, I wish everybody luck. This isn't. It is a little bit more complicated than the FAFSA. There's no getting around that. But as long as you have all your information with you as you sit down to do the form, you should be able to get through it. If you have questions, you can always put the question in the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. We have a lot of people with a lot of experience in there who could help. And there's one, it was kind of a simple question, but I'm just going to repeat it because it was asked multiple times. People asked, can I submit this CSS profile after my student gets accepted? No. That is like a straight out no. I mean, because as everything you've heard tonight, colleges, A, they have deadlines for financial aid forms, and B, they, whether or not they're using the information as part of the, admissions decision, which I'm not saying a lot of them do, but all this is happening at the same time before they send out decisions. So you cannot wait until after the student is accepted. You can do that for FAFSA, because if you're not going to get any need-based aid and you just want the loans, you can apply after your student gets accepted, but you can't do that for the CSS profile.
No, you really have to watch those deadlines.
Yeah, you really have to watch the deadlines. Deadlines are like, it's a simple thing to say, but it is so important. It relates to so many scholarship deadlines, obviously the application deadline, these financial aid deadlines.
And the state deadlines.
State deadline. Somebody's asking what's the deadline for the CSS profile. The deadline is what the school says the deadline is. So each school has their own financial aid form deadline. So and it's not on the College Board, it's on the college's website. You have to go to the financial aid page.
Right. Yeah, that's like one of the most important things about this conversation is check out those deadlines and make a spreadsheet out, so you're all prepared to know, especially if you have a lot of college choices.
Yeah.
Don't miss them, because you might be out on there might be certain state, federal, or institutional grant funding buckets that you're missing out on if you miss the deadlines. So be careful with those.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kat. Go rest your voice. And we will see everyone again soon on a different topic in a few weeks.